Hello, everyone, and, and welcome to the Lackawanna Historical Society's Catlin House. We are delighted and shocked to see so many people here today, and it is wonderful that you're all here to celebrate the historic Rocky Glen Park and our memories of Rocky Glen. I have to move somewhere, I think. I think some folks are coming downstairs. We can move it down to Rocky Glen. Before we begin, I do just want to make a few quick announcements. We do have a restroom on the side here. If you're going to make a little visit to the restroom, be very careful because we are taping today's program, which will be incorporated into the documentary and also played on ECTV. So I want to thank Mark Migliori for being here today and helping us get this on film. I also want to let you know that we will be serving ice cream after the program. We do have iced tea and lemonade in here. Because it's so crowded and you're going to get hot, if at any point you're feeling that you need to come back and get a drink, just raise your hand or let me know and we'll get you some water or something to keep you going. And also just some upcoming programs of the Lackawanna Historical Society. On June 21st, we are delighted to announce that we will be running the Historic House Tour in the Hill. This has always been a very popular event. That's why we do it every other year, because it's such a big event. It takes a lot of time and planning. And we do have 6 properties that will be on the tour this year: the Colonnade at 401 Jefferson Avenue, the Duffy Butala home at 830 Taylor Avenue, one of the Monsoor properties at 1213 East Gibson Street, the Scartelli property, which is our under construction property this year, 724 North Webster, the Simrel home at 241 Arthur, and the Zapponi home at 745 North Irving. Tickets will be going on sale starting next week. So if you want to get a ticket for the house tour, the cost of the tour in advance is $25. If you decide to buy it on the day of the tour, which is June 21st, Father's Day, from 11 a.m. to 4 p.m., it's $30. Also this year we'll be having a special pre-tour event, a cocktail party at the Colonnade. That is on the Friday evening before the tour, June 19th. The cost of that is $45 and the benefit is the Historical Society, so try to support us with that. If you really love the Historical Society and you want to support us throughout the entire weekend of June 19th, then consider buying the combination ticket. That saves you $10. For $60, you can go to the cocktail party and to the house tour on the following Sunday. And another event, I just want you to mark your calendars because we're changing our schedule this year. We usually have our annual dinner in September, but because we have a special speaker coming and he can only come in August, we're moving the date of our annual dinner. It will be August 26th. It's a Wednesday. It will be at the Radisson, and our speaker will be Burton Folsom, who wrote Urban Capitalists, which is really one of the books about the coal barons who were in the Lackawanna Valley. So we're very excited that Burton is going to speak at our dinner, and we're just asking you to save the date, August 26th, and try to join us for that event. Now, today's program. It is my sincere pleasure to introduce today's speaker. He has an undergraduate degree from Wilkes University with a major in political science and minors in history and business administration. He has a master's degree from Marywood University in education, and he is a certified teacher in Pennsylvania and is employed at the LIU number 18, that's the Luzerne Intermediate Unit, as a transition education specialist. He is a member of the Lackawanna County Arts and Education Council. He is a secretary and trustee or board member of the Lackawanna Heritage Valley Authority, and he is the vice president of the Greater Carbondale Arts Alliance. He's also a member of the 2009 Steamtown Railfest Planning Committee, and he is a Rocky Glen documentarian. He's also my husband. So, ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome our favorite Rocky Glen guy, Bob Savakinas.
Well, thank you, everyone. Once again, it shows how influential and how important Rocky Glen is or has been in our history here in Lackawanna and also in Luzerne County. Never expected this kind of a turnout. We expected a good crowd because, as I like to say, there's a tidal wave of Rocky Glen people out there, and every now and then, once a year or so, we try and bring it in, and it crashes in. And it all started basically 3 years ago. We had a program here in which I had an exhibit. 2 years ago, or excuse me, last year, we had the marker dedication down at the Rocky Glen site, in which the state of Pennsylvania honored us in Rocky Glen with the state historic marker designating it as a very important site in our history. I had a state official that said to me it was one of the largest marker dedications, ceremonies that they've ever been at in terms of a crowd. And again, what does that tell us? It tells us again the importance of Rocky Glen and how important it was in our history. A couple things I'd like to just start off with. I want to thank the Lackawanna Historical Society and, of course, Mary Ann, because she does such a good job here with the Historical Society. If anybody isn't familiar with this brochure, it's a membership to the Lackawanna Historical Society. I know a lot of people here are members, but if you're not, please consider joining as being a member, because this organization, that's what they're all about, preserving history, preserving the memories, allowing us all to go back in time and reflect upon what, for most of us, were better times. Again, please consider joining the Historical Society. There are flyers throughout the Catlin House here, and of course you can see what a wonderful facility, home this is. Second of all, I'd like to also acknowledge a family that's here, the Azzarelli family. They are very involved in preserving and talking about local history. Next Sunday, June 7th, they're going to have their Forest Hill Cemetery tour. It's at 2 o'clock. Again, there's no charge for that, but because of their dedication and love for history, the Azzarelli family, they do productions and do things like this. They're a good friend of mine for Rocky Glen, for the Historical Society, so please go out and support their programs as well. You're welcome, Dominic. Basically what I want to do is I just want to talk a little bit about why we're all here, and then I'll get into the PowerPoint and talk a little bit about the history of Rocky Glen. My only comment, though, is how do you put 100 years of history within 1 hour? We'll attempt to do that. It's just going to be a glossing over of a lot of facts, a lot of people that were involved in Rocky Glen, and again, it's long, long history. It all begins with Arthur Frothingham, who we consider to be the P.T. Barnum of Scranton. We moved on to a couple of other owners. We had the legendary Ben Sterling and his family involved. And in some modesty, I'm going to attempt to say that I'm trying to follow in their footsteps, and I'm going to try and open up Rocky Glen again today for an hour or two. When we had the marker dedication, I made that same statement that we opened up Rocky Glen in our hearts and minds, at least for an hour or two. And again, today we're going to try and do that one more time, if only, again, for that brief hour or two. On mostly everybody's seats, and for people who didn't get them, we do have extra tickets as well. I left a little souvenir, I'm calling it. It's your ticket, your admission to Rocky Glen Day here again today. So consider that your admission to coming into Rocky Glen at least one more time for a few hours again. Just like to start off with a little bit, again, of a remark or so. You're driving a car at a constant speed. On your left side is a drop-off, maybe 18 to 20 inches below the level that you're traveling. Your right side is a fire engine traveling at the same speed as you are. In front of you is a galloping horse, which is the same size as your car, and you can't overtake it. Behind you is another galloping horse. Both horses are also traveling at the same speed that you are. What must you do to safely get out of this highly dangerous situation? Get off the merry-go-round. That's exactly it. Glad that somebody over here knows that answer very well. No, that's the merry-go-round. And I do have some stories on the merry-go-rounds at Rocky Glen that we'll get to. Again, I'm going to just try and bring back the idea of why Rocky Glen is so important to us here. What I basically have is 3 newspaper clippings. There were full-page stories that were run a few years back when I talked about the history of Rocky Glen and the amusement park, and we did a display. And then last year, actually a few months ago, another story on the documentary that we're working on. At the end of the program, I'll give an update as to where we are with the documentary. But what more can be said? Within the last 2 to 3 years, we have 3 full-page stories on Rocky Glen Park. Again, why? Because it had such an importance to us here. And again, that's why we have this crowd. Back in 1997, 1998, there was a petition drive to save Rocky Glen as a state park. A couple of individuals were involved with it, and what we had, and I've become the keeper of these documents, were petitions signed by over 4,000 people. And these are the documents that show over 4,000 people signed off to save it as a state park. What does the future hold for Rocky Glen? We don't know. My goal in trying to promote it is that someday potentially we could save a part of it. I know we'll never see it as an amusement park, but it would be so nice to save just a little part of our history that was here with us for 101 years. To be able to use it maybe just as a small park to go down, to take our families, to reminisce and remember the good times, to put some historical markers just designating the $1 Million Coaster, all the rides that were down there, the Swiss Cottage, the Sterling family, the Frothingham families, the Nail and Jennings families, all the families that were involved in Rocky Glen. That's why I'm out here bringing people's attention to what a wonderful sight it was, to make people think about what Rocky Glen meant to us all. With that being said then, I think it's about time that we finally move on to a little bit history of Rocky Glen. The easiest way to begin the history of Rocky Glen starts off with this plaque, which is quite heavy. I'm going to read the plaque to everyone. It was donated by the Sterling family to the Historical Society, and we thank you for that. On this stone, in 1886, Arthur Frothingham conceived the idea of Rocky Glen Park to entertain and bring laughter to the people of the Wyoming and Lackawanna valleys. And for 101 years, that's what it did. It brought us a lot of good memories and good times. And the plaque again shows how important Rocky Glen was. You ask yourself again very easily, why does the Historical Society look a little different today? How does it look different? Because we're turning it into an amusement park, at least again, for a little while. There's going to be ice cream served later. I want to thank Douglas Forer, a CPA, also a board member, trustee of the Historical Society, for underwriting a good part of our ice cream bar today. We have cotton candy over there, a couple bags of it. And Marianne's not aware of this. What else I have with me? Just for the fun of it, we have balloons, because what else would be complete with an amusement park without some balloons? And I'll probably step on them later and get myself into trouble, but. One last comment before I actually get into the history of it. Why am I that interested in Rocky Glen Park? It's something that probably most everybody here could relate to. It was so important in our history, it meant so much to us here. And to me as a child, I went there and spent many times there. School picnics, going with my family. And so everybody in this audience could thank my mom sitting right there in the front, because she's the person who got me going to Rocky Glen, and it continues for all these years. Thank you, Mom. I know we have a couple of people in the audience that later towards the end of the program I want to acknowledge, and I just want to also talk about a few things that they're involved with us here. But let us move on to the history of Rocky Glen. Starts off in 1885. It's an auction in Pennsylvania, and what do we have? A man by the name of Arthur Frothingham. He goes down to an auction and purchases 225 acres of land for the price of $15. Something to really consider. That piece of land, $15. Arthur Frothingham, this is our historical marker for those who aren't familiar with it or haven't seen it. It's right down on the Rocky Glen site. You can take a ride down on it, down on 502, turn on the Rocky Glen Road, pull along the side of the road. Again, please be very careful. Take a look at the marker and reflect upon how important it was again to our area. Please don't go on the Rocky Glen property, because that is private property. But the sign, of course, is on the state side. Next slide, please. This is the marker dedication. A variety of officials, individuals, some of whom are in our audience. And again, that was on August the 9th. We had a very wonderful day that day. I was told by a state official it was one of the largest attended state marker dedications. And again, that shows some of the crowd that was there. And again, it reflects today on what a good crowd we have here today as well. And there we have probably the most famous shot of Rocky Glen. It shows the $1 Million roller coaster, the lake, the dam that was constructed by Mr. Frothingham. Just a funny little story. He had, over the years, a couple of battles and things with different owners, and what he ended up doing at one point, and again, what a showman he was, what a P.T. Barnum he was, what he did was he drained the lake and he planted a wheat field in it, just to bring it down so that people wouldn't be attending it when he was having his battles with other officials. But, of course, obviously the lake was refilled, and we had the park flourishing. But the most famous shot of Rocky Glen, the $1 Million Coaster and the lake again. And we are on to one of the Arthur Frothingham buildings. It was the old arcade building built on the 200 block of Wyoming Ave. It was called the Frothingham Theater. You could see how ornate everything was involved with it. And again, Mr. Frothingham was an individual who just was a showman. It was also known, another building that he put up was called the Lyceum Theater. The history of the Lyceum Theater will again become important to us as we begin to move on. We have a new owner by the name of A.J. Duffy, who was the former manager of the Lyceum Theater. And in 1919, he purchased part of the Rocky Glen Park for Arthur Frothingham for the price of $100,000. We're looking at 1919. Think of that again, the numbers, $100,000. There was a lot of money that was transferred through Rocky Glen. There was a lot of people that went there, and I'll talk a little bit about the details on that. Excellent. A nice, serene picture of Rocky Glen. Probably looking at the 19s. Again, it shows how important and how long it played a part in our history. Just look at the beautiful lake and the opportunities that people had just to spend down there with some solitude. Excellent. More pictures again of Rocky Glen in the early 19s. The boating. Just continuing again to show, I'm hoping that people could see over here. I could back up just slightly, and if you need to see. Rocky Glen Park, we think of it as a summer destination. We also see it as a winter destination. There was a lot of skating activities held down there, a lot of events that were winter sports related. Just to show a little bit again of the winter activities that took place in the 19s, the 20s, even up to the 1930s. The Swiss Cottage, I'll talk a little bit about the Swiss Cottage later, but for now, let me just move on and talk a little bit about the owners of what we had. Our area was basically, we know it involved heavy industry. It involved the coal miners. It involved garment workers. It involved the railroads. Where did these people go and what did they do for recreation on weekends? They worked hard in the mines, and we all know the history. They worked hard in the silk mills, in the garment industry. They worked hard on the railroads, in the mills. They went to Rocky Glen for their destination. The Laurel Line, I'll talk a little bit about the Laurel Line. The Laurel Line was established, and its destination point, one of its major destination points was Rocky Glen. Why was it Rocky Glen? It was a place for people to spend their weekend, mainly Sundays, just to have some recreation and leisure. I have a letter here dated July of 1933. I'll just read part of the letter. Outing Committee, won't you kindly place the enclosed nickel day bill in the hands of the proper party? These reduced fares on the Laurel Line and reductions in rides and refreshments at the Glen are in effect all day Tuesdays to provide a wonderful opportunity for a pleasant outing at a little expense. And this statement is probably the most telling of the times. Many stores are taking advantage of these depression prices and are arranging basket parties after closing hours. You will find the Glen an attractive improvement that constantly upgrades are being made to the highest standards. This letter was dated July of 1933 on Rocky Glen letterheads, telling us about a fun house, a dodgem, a coaster, two coasters actually, the whip, seaplanes, a tumblebug, etc. Again, it tells us the history. 1933, the Depression is going on, and Rocky Glen is playing a very important part in our lives and our history here during the Depression. For those who want to know about our history, you could hear Steamtown chugging by. Unfortunately, no. There's so much memorabilia, so much information that I've been collecting over the last several years in researching this, and that's one of the reasons why I'm pausing, trying to get things, because there's just not enough room on this podium to put everything out. I want to thank Ed Miller. He wasn't able to be with us here today. Ed Miller is actually out of town this weekend, and he's at, I believe, a rail event. But we know Ed Miller as Mr. Laureline. I've met with him for several hours, spoke to him, and he's given me some nice information. We have him interviewed also for the documentary. But Ed gives me a piece of information here of the L&WV, Lackawanna Wyoming Valley Railway, otherwise known as the Laureline. This piece of information tells me and tells us that in 1920, total revenue, $923,557.74. Total passengers, 4.2 million. I'm just rounding off. 4.2 million in 1920. Let's see it in 1921. Total revenue, $1,067,954, again rounding off. Total passengers, 4.3 million. Just imagine that. 4.3 million traveling the Laureline. And guess where one of its destinations was? Rocky Glen Park. The Laureline ran 24 hours a day, every 20 minutes, and Rocky Glen was one of its destinations. Just again, think of the numbers. In the 1920s, revenue over $1 million, passengers over 4 million. What do we see that's important in our area? We see all of the nationalities, all the ethnic groups that blended here, that melded together to form a cohesive workforce, to form a unified Lackawanna County, Luzerne County. This is an example. This was Welch Day in 1921. Look at the crowds of people down there. And Rocky Glen would become famous for what they call ethnic days. One of the pictures of Rocky Glen in the 1930s, you can see the Coca-Cola sign, so we know they were still around in the 30s. Part of the Midway, and again, the beautiful landscape in the background. A roller coaster. It's hard to believe, but in the 1920s, Rocky Glen had a roller coaster. It was called a Pippin. People got off the Laureline and got onto the Pippin. Of course, further down the road, they got off and got onto a much more famous coaster, the $1 Million Coaster, which cost $100,000, but I'll get back to talking about that a little bit more so. That's another picture, not of the $1 Million Coaster, but of the Pippin that operated. This would be the dam area down at Rocky Glen, again with the coaster alongside of it. Just more pictures of the coaster. I'm sure we have a lot of coaster enthusiasts in the audience. We have historians in the audience, Rocky Glen fans in the audience, some family and friends of mine in the audience, a little bit of everybody, but roller coaster. And there is the Laureline, the famous Laureline. People got off at the platform, which was at Rocky Glen, as I talked about, nickel day. For a nickel, they got into an amusement park and had an opportunity to spend the day there, mainly on weekends again, because families were too busy working 5-6 days a week. They didn't have much time to use for recreation. This was their recreation destination via the Laureline. Another famous picture of the Laureline coming down. And this actually is the $1 Million Coaster. And we'll pause there for a minute, and I'll get back to a little bit more history of Rocky Glen. I'm trying to keep this so that everybody gets a little bit of a flavor as far as rides go, history goes, because there is so much on Rocky Glen. So we have Arthur Frothingham, who, as I said earlier, sold off part of Rocky Glen to A.J. Duffy, who was his former manager at the Lyceum Theater. 1921, we have John Nalen and Joe Jennings purchasing the rest from Arthur Frothingham of Rocky Glen, the remaining interest in the park. They paid $60,000. 1920s, 1930s, we have ethnic days at Rocky Glen. I've read stories of up to 20,000 people were coming for Polish Day, Welsh Day, Irish Day, Italian Day, German Day, all of the various ethnic groups in our area. 20,000 plus people coming there. Again, what does that tell us? How important and how influential Rocky Glen was. We had a very interesting situation that developed. Before I get into that, let me go back to Ben Sterling, or at least begin to talk about Ben Sterling. Ben Sterling was legendary in our area. He had such a commitment to our community, and it all began in 1924 for Ben Sterling. He began to operate concession stands and arcades down at Rocky Glen. 1936, he became one of the part owners of Rocky Glen Park. Unfortunately, a feud develops between the Nalen, Jennings, and Sterling groups. Legal battles in 1945 and 46, and a fence is constructed between Rocky Glen Park and the Nayland Jennings Park. The fence was built in 1941, and it was erected to divide the park into two sections. We actually had two separate parks operating. Some people may not realize that or remember those days, obviously, but there actually were two separate parks operating there. The fence, for most people, you probably would envision something a lot more different than I envisioned. A fence separating two parks. I thought it'd be a lot bigger and a lot more involved. This photo I just recently obtained, so it's not in the PowerPoint, but it shows basically just a wooden fence from 6 to 12 feet high dividing the two parks. So it really wasn't a concrete barrier, cinder block wall or anything. It was just something very informal, and I know it's difficult to see, but it was just a wooden fence that was constructed to separate two properties. Of course, if we did that nowadays, we know what would happen. The concrete and everything would be installed, and steel barriers and things like that. Anyway, 1951, Ben Sterling buys out what's left of the Jennings and Naylands Park, unites the two parks together, and basically we probably see the heyday, the glory days of Rocky Glen under Ben Sterling and his family. He becomes the owner until 1970, and a newspaper quote tells me that the Sterlings were described as generous people to a fault. Just going to back up a second again, and again, as I continue to just find all the archives and get more information from all the wonderful people out there who are donating things, who are giving me copies, giving me stories and things like that. But this is the first time that I've ever seen an ad for the Nayland Jennings Park Company of Rocky Glen Park. So this was an ad of Rocky Glen Park under the Nayland Jennings Park Company. So again, if people at the end of this, if they want to spend a few moments, I'll have some of this, people want to look at it again. It's the first time I've ever seen an ad, though, and I don't know if anybody, how often you'd find that ad. On to the $1 Million Coaster. Talk a little bit about some of the rides at Rocky Glen Park now. We're looking at the $1 Million Coaster. The Laurel line again coming up. That was Ed Miller's photo that he took, and again, it's famous. I know it's made the Railway Society's calendars, and I'm sure it's made a lot of other pieces of publication, but it's a famous photo tying in the Laurel line and the $1 Million Coaster. The $1 Million Coaster, a quote, described as one of the best in the East. It was built in 1945, and it was ahead of its time. The park height, the peak height was 96 feet. The length of the ride, 4,700 feet. In the first 3 years of operation, 3 million people rode this coaster. It cost $100,000 to build, and it was made of ash wood. Compare that to what we see now. And as I said in my earlier statement, it was ahead of its time. We talk about thrill rides now of roller coasters and their dips and being by a water, being by a lake or a body of water. The $1 Million Coaster had it all right there. Next slide. Another very famous postcard that was put out by the Sterling family to promote Rocky Glen, including the $1 Million Coaster and all the rides. I also acquired a business card, which is basically the same, and on the back it has Ben and May Sterling. I thought, what a unique business card to use. In the age of computers now, and everybody has such high-tech programs and things like that, but their business card from back in the 40s, 50s, had a nice glossy front, including this image, along with their information, their contact information on the back. Hold off on that, and let me talk a little bit more about the rides. The merry-go-rounds. Rocky Glen had 5 throughout its lifetime. The most recent merry-go-round that was there was a 1903 C.W. Parker carousel, hand-carved in Germany. In 1988, there was an auction at Rocky Glen. That carousel sold for $242,000. What does that tell us about the investment that was made in Rocky Glen Park? There was a sky ride at Rocky Glen. It was 40 feet up in the air. It went around 360 feet for a round trip. We went through the slide of the Swiss Cottage. The Swiss Cottage was built in May of 1937. It cost $24,000. 1946, a funhouse was built. It cost $25,000. 1947, a dance hall with 20,000 square feet that could hold 5,000 people was built at the cost of $100,000. A Crystal Palace dance hall was built also in addition, and it was converted at times to the dance hall. But what a name, Crystal Palace. Why was it called a Crystal Palace? It was glass enclosed. 1947, a glass enclosed structure. Why did we have such a fancy, ornate structure? Because of these people that came here, the celebrities that mainly the Sterling family brought in under the ownership of Rocky Glen. We had the Dorsey brothers. We had Benny Goodman, Guy Lombardo, Jimmy Durante, the Lone Ranger. The Lone Ranger. And in the documentary, I have some footage of the Lone Ranger and his appearance at Rocky Glen. So, down the road, we'll have a chance to actually view that. Not today, but when the documentary is completed. Chuck Connors of the Riflemen and the Westerns fame. And in 1939, some people have wondered, but in 1939, in my research, I found out that a certain person by the name of Harry James, some people may know him as a musician as well, but he told us about a new singer who was going to be at Rocky Glen, and his name was Frank Sinatra. 1939, Frank Sinatra was at Rocky Glen. How about we move into the 1950s? A person by the name of Walt Disney came to Rocky Glen. How did that influence his parks? I don't know. But Walt Disney came to Rocky Glen in the 1950s. And he stayed at the Sterling House. Brings us up to this picture now. How's that for a crowd? We have people actually sitting in trees. Anybody want to guess what day this is? You got it. Warm Day Radio. The Mighty 590. That was a cover of Amusement Business, which was a nationally published magazine. So in 1965, this was in the amusement park industry, we made the headlines because of these crowds. Why do we talk about Warm Day now? 50,000 people attended days at Warm Days. Bobby Vinton? Bobby Vinton. Roses are red, violets are blue. The beginning of his career was at Rocky Glen with that song. The Beach Boys. I had an interesting story told to me about the Beach Boys and their appearance, that, again, they were up and coming. Somebody asked me, the person who I was speaking to told us about, who are these 4 young kids from California that are racking up phone bills so high? They were the Beach Boys. How about the Three Stooges? Three Stooges were at Rocky Glen. Let's look a little bit more at what Rocky Glen offered as far as the community goes. Actually, there's more pictures of Warm Day. They're hard to make out, but the crowds, the people coming up via car, walking. We talk about Montage Mountain in the 90s, 2000s, people walking up to Montage to see the concerts. Rocky Glen did it back in the 60s. Back again to one of the famous photos. We have a copy of that over there, almost as a mural type that was donated to me also for our Rocky Glen project. Let's go back to talking a little bit about what Rocky Glen offered to the community. Free swimming lessons were given by the Red Cross at Rocky Glen Lake. In August of 1939, the national long-distance swimming matches were held at Rocky Glen. We're not talking about Pennsylvania, we're talking about the national matches were held. We're moving on now into Ghost Town, the Ghost Town era. Ben Sterling and his family in 1970 said, it's about time to retire and spend some time with the grandchildren. Got a beautiful picture of the 3 grandchildren. Again, unfortunately, I haven't been able to include it in the PowerPoint, but we will include that down the road in the documentary. National Recreation Service Incorporated of Atlanta, in October of 1970, buys Rocky Glen Park. Cost, $500,000. National Recreation Services Incorporated of Atlanta owns a chain of themed ghost town parks. Most people don't realize that, but there was a chain of them. There was one in California, there was one in North Carolina, one in Atlanta. That's what my research has found so far. There's a park right now still in North Carolina called Ghost Town in the Sky. And it's the last remaining tie to Ghost Town in the Glen up here. But it's still in existence. There's a copy of the brochure from when it became Ghost Town Park. A little bit more information on what we had at Ghost Town Park. We had the water slides, which were new at it. We had a ferry boat, went across the lake. We had the antique cars. The antique cars, I'll just say about them, if you ever go down to Knobel's Grove, which is a family-type amusement park that's geared somewhat to what Rocky Glen was, the antique cars are from Rocky Glen. The bumper boats down at Rocky Glen are down also at Knoebels. So we still have a few rides that are still operating locally down there. Ghost Town in the Sky. It exists in North Carolina. Some of these photos, again, aren't included, but I'll just pull them up for a moment or so as I talk a little bit about Ghost Town in the Glen. Now we're appealing more to our younger group here, our people in their 30s, 40s, and probably early 50s, although if you're a little bit older, you probably spent some time also at Ghost Town in the Glen. Let's think about Ghost Town in the Glen. It was constructed as a western town. I've been talking with a couple individuals as well who worked at Ghost Town and were a part of converting it. They were also the gunfighters that eventually got hired. They got these jobs when they came back from Vietnam. So they were hired. They came back from Vietnam. They were hired to work at Ghost Town, and they became the gunfighters. They gave me some very good stories. Do we have any of the gunfighters in the audience? We have them in the back. Thank you guys for coming, and we'll let you share a few stories in a little while. But those guys back there have been so helpful in coming forward and telling us a little bit about their times down at Ghost Town in the Glen and what it was like to be a gunfighter and everything. Let's talk a little bit about what we had down there. We had shootouts. We had a saloon. And probably what a lot of people remember is we had the can-can dancers. We had the old western town. We had the bank. Quick picture of one of the gunfights, one of the shootouts. Next slide. Ghost Town in the Glen. It closes in 1979 as Ghost Town in the Glen. A company by the name of GT Management of New Jersey buys the park. They own several parks in New York and New Jersey. Once again, we're going to bring in some celebrities. We bring in a designer. GT Management brings in a designer of one of the most famous amusement parks in the United States, Cedar Point Park in Sandusky, Ohio. For anybody that watches the Travel Channel, almost every year, I believe every year, when they count down the best amusement parks in the United States, Cedar Point in Sandusky, Ohio is always rated the highest, or rated number one. This gentleman that they bring in is also on the planning commission of the Disney Corporation. So Walt Disney, again, shows his ties in with Rocky Glen Park and his company. A new Rocky Glen is now constructed. That is one of the roller coasters at the new Rocky Glen. It's got 33 rides, including a 4-story high water slide. Picture of the Red Barn Theater. Several local musicians I've been talking with, that's where they performed. They were the warm-up acts for, and I'll get to that in a little while, some of the big concerts that were held at Rocky Glen in the 1980s. 1983, a group of local investors looks at leasing Rocky Glen Park from the company from New Jersey, GT Management. They lease the park in 1983, and guess what they do? They bring back the ethnic festivals again. There was a 5-day Bavarian festival held. 50,000 people attended it, 1983. We have Irish days, Polish days, Italian days, all coming back again to Rocky Glen. 1984, 40 rides we now have. 15 new pavilions are added. We're off a little bit. That would have been Boot Hill. Our gunfighter guys could probably tell us about that at the end of the gunfight, that's where the person went, up to Boot Hill. So part of Ghost Town in the Glen. The ethnic festivals. Again, look at the crowds. We looked at 1965 for warm days. We looked at the Welch Day picture in the 1920s. Now we're in the 1980s. We still have some nice crowds. Fireworks, ethnic days, costumes, festivals held. The antique cars, which again are down at Knoebels. The water slide. The Sea Dragon. The Sea Dragon was one of the last rides that was added to Rocky Glen while it still existed as a park. Do we have enough going on at Rocky Glen with the rides? Yes and no. The ethnic days, they're still bringing in the people. but it's time to bring the celebrities back again. It's time to have concerts again at Rocky Glen. Before there was Montage Mountain, before there was the Wachovia Arena, before we had all of the different major venues that are out there now, we had Rocky Glen Park. How about Bon Jovi? His career began there. Jerry Garcia, not the Grateful Dead, but Jerry Garcia. Eddie Money, Ted Nugent, Steppenwolf, Al Martino, Jefferson Starship, Huey Lewis and the News. Again, major celebrities back in the 80s that their careers were either starting or they're at their peak. Basically what I just heard, rock and roll concerts were held there. We had a local radio station that broadcast daily from the Midway at Rocky Glen, KRZ, just as they were beginning to get started in the 80s. The local Jerry Lewis telethon was held there, but unfortunately we end up with a problem. It's time to start competing with mega parks. The mega parks, your Dorney Park, your Great Adventure, your Hershey Park, they're all expanding to the thrill seekers and the thrill rides. People want to travel more. They're not going to spend so much time locally. And unfortunately, attendance down at Rocky Glen starts going downhill. Some people have wondered why there was such a major shift in the small amusement parks closing in the mid to late 80s. We had Angela Park up in the Hazleton Drums area. We had Hanson's Park up in Harvey's Lake. We had Sans Souci Park down in Hanover Township. And we had Rocky Glen. 4 amusement parks in our area, relatively all closed in the 80s. Why? 1983, I find out that there was a fire in a New Jersey amusement park in which 8 people were killed. Brought a lot of uproar in the amusement industry and with legislators. January 1985, a new law is enacted which makes it very strict for public safety, park safety, with many, many new regulations. Insurance costs are going to skyrocket. Consequently, we end up with a lot of deficits for parks. Right there is pretty much the last photo of Rocky Glen Park the way it existed and operated up until 1987. I don't mean the last photo taken there, but the last photo of how it looked. The roller coaster, which had various names over its time, the Jetstar, the Comet, things like that. I don't know how to say it, but I guess unfortunately, in the 90s, we had a series of fires down there which destroyed several of the structures that were left. 1988, a major auction was held. I spoke a little bit about the carousel. That was auctioned off. It was a company, I believe, from Cincinnati that came in and auctioned off the rides. There were, again, a lot of people that attended, a lot of people that just wanted to remember and reflect on the good old times, if you want to call it that. So unfortunately, Rocky Glen Park closed 1987, 1988. The auction is held. Basically, things remain pretty much dormant down there through the years. That is probably the most famous logo of Rocky Glen Park, the clown face. We had a closing of Rocky Glen Park, and it pretty much sat quiet. A group of people over time have been advocating. I talked about the petitions, the thousands of signatures. What does the future of Rocky Glen Park hold? A development? Possibly. Most likely. Probably the best thing that we could ask of the potential new developers, whoever they may be, is just the idea, preserve a little bit of Rocky Glen Park for future generations. Just a small piece of that land. There's 240 acres down there. We need a little bit preserved to remember our history with the historical markers, with the documentation and everything of Rocky Glen Park. On a more positive note, I want to say August 9th, 2008, we had our marker dedication, and I spoke earlier about that. A lot of people involved. The state told us how important Rocky Glen Park was. The Lackawanna County Commissioners, they gave us a proclamation for Rocky Glen Day. Currently, where are we? I'm working on a documentary on Rocky Glen Park. I'm working with 2 other partners on Rocky Glen Park to preserve its memory, its legacy, its history. The documentary, for those, again, who have a seat in this section, there were tickets. It tells us that on August 15th, we're going to have the release date at Steamtown. I want to thank Steamtown National Historic Site. They're going to allow us to use their theater, which holds up to 500 people. I'm hoping to fill all those seats. Afterwards, I want to thank Lackawanna County because we're going to go over to the Trolley Museum and we're going to have a reception there, a party to bring out some of the Rocky Glen memorabilia, to bring everybody together again to share some good times and good memories. just a couple other things I just want to wrap up on. I want to mention the gunfighters in the back. Thank you guys for your help and your involvement. I want to mention Gretchen Sterling and Clem Danowski, I believe. Clem was a good friend of Ben Sterling's and has a lot of history with the Park of Rocky Glen. And Gretchen Sterling is the granddaughter of Ben Sterling, and she's also been very helpful in helping me put this documentary together. Gretchen and Clem. I also want to acknowledge an individual by the name of Walter Turner. Walter, where are you? Walter's over there. And why am I recognizing Walter? He works with the Clifford Township Volunteer Fire Company. July 23rd, 24th, and 25th, they're having their annual picnic fair, if you want to call it that as well. There was a train that operated at Rocky Glen, and it was purchased in 1954 from the Sterlings, and they bring it out once a year during this fair for people to ride it. So if people want to have a little nostalgia and probably have some good food and a good time, you could go on the website, or you could just look for Clifford Township Volunteer Fire Company's picnic fair, July 23rd, 24th, and 25th, and ride the train that was at Rocky Glen. Now, as I said, I want to have a little bit of fun with this. I don't want to just stand up here and talk and just do things like that and just make it an ordinary lecture, because Rocky Glen is not an ordinary subject, at least for me. Does anybody have any questions at this point I'd like to try and answer?
You did mention the third rail.
The third rail. The third rail would be famous because of the Laurel Line. It was an electrified system for transporting the Laurel Line and its cars to Rocky Glen, operating between Wilkes-Barre and Scranton, various stops and destinations. The reason that the third rail was so important was because that was its form of transporting, of moving the Laurel Line, and it was electrified. And of course, for the older folks in the audience, you'll realize that we all were told, or people were told, stay off of that third rail because it's electrified, and guess what? It wouldn't be pleasant if you got somehow caught with it or touched it. Fried, basically. Thank you. Any other comments, questions, thoughts? Yes?
Who owns the property now?
I don't actually know. Where we left off, there was the company, it resorted back to the original owners, GT Enterprises, and the owner had various homes, from what I've heard, in New York, New Jersey, and Israel. He may have sold it since then to another corporation, or he may still own it. At this point, it's not really known. Yes?
Just as a point of information, in Carbondale City Council chambers, we have a portrait of Gideon Frothingham, who was a mayor of Carbondale, and I suspect there's probably a relationship between Gideon and Arthur, although what it might be, I'm not sure, but I mean, I bet you somewhere along the line they're on the same family tree. So the Frothingham name has been around for quite a while, so it's interesting to pursue that and see if there is a connection between Gideon and Arthur, but it's a long time Lackawanna Valley name, and I'm not surprised that Arthur Frothingham shows up in Rocky Glen.
Well, that is Dr. S. Robert Powell from the Carbondale Historical Society, their president, and he just gave me some more information and more things that I need to research and look into. But Mr. Frothingham, there is a street in Pittston named after him, Frothingham Ave. And where my last research left off, Mr. Frothingham, when he sold off everything, he ended up going to New York. So, but I will continue to pursue that suggestion as well. Yes?
I remember in the mid-'80s, Henshaw boxed at Rocky Glen. They had a big boxing match there.
I actually didn't even get into that because, there's the history of it, and there's so many things, but there was a boxing bowl that was constructed in Rocky Glen for major boxing matches under, again, the Sterling ownership. And Rocky Marciano, I know, made several appearances there. The Boxing Bowl held also up to 5,000 people, and it was called the Glen Bowl, coincidentally enough, and it was an outdoor stadium. And in my research, again, I found a couple of photos on that, but unfortunately, I haven't had time to put everything onto the PowerPoint. But so there were boxing days down at Rocky Glen, and just to carry the athletic theme also forward, I know in the 1980s I was told that, I guess when wrestling was very popular also. There was a bunch of celebrity wrestlers there, including people like Ivan Putski. So for people who are wrestling fans, they were also there in the 80s. Any other questions? Yes?
Not a question, I was just going to say that our Sunday school class used to walk from Taylor over to Rocky Glen about once a year, just to have a good time. And another thing, you didn't mention among all the rides over there, there was an airplane, or I think they had about 4 on a ride. You had to walk up steps to get to it, and you'd ride around on that airplane. That was pretty exciting.
I didn't even get into all the rides, the heyday and the tumble bugs and all the rides, because there's just, again, so much history and so much we could talk about with the rides. But thank you for also bringing that up. There was a postcard booklet that was put out, and some of the rides, and I believe the airplane ride was one of the postcards also included with that.
The Lyceum Theater, is that what later became the Comerford?
Yes. No. Our Historical Society director is telling me no. Would you care to address that then?
I think the Lyceum was on Penn Avenue. The full line from the Comerford to Camden Road. But I think it was the Lyceum first.
Another question?
Were the village people ever there?
Not that I know of. Although in the 70s, I'm sure they had, well, they actually were doing the cowboy and the western theme, so maybe. But not in my research yet. I haven't found that. Was Steven Seagal there? Not yet, but maybe one day. It's an inside joke. I met Steven Seagal several years ago, and we try and include him in everything. So maybe we could film a movie down there with Steven Seagal one day. Anybody else? On this side, does anybody have any questions or anything? Yes?
Is there anything there now that's been developed since the new owners took over?
No. For the past 20-plus years, it stays the same. The lake is still beautiful down there. Actually, I was down there yesterday doing some filming. I did have permission to be there. I interviewed a couple individuals, and we got a little bit of the lake in the background and everything. So the land and the lake are still beautiful down there, but the land continues just to sit the way it is, which maybe is for the best.
They used to have Perv and Dairy Days there. Do the other dairies do things like that too?
I don't know, but I assume. The question was asked, was Perv and Dairy, did they had days down there as a business? Were there other dairies? And I actually am not sure, but again, in my research, anything's possible with people telling us. Yes, I was just informed by one of our experts back there, Clem, that there were other dairies that held events there. Strip ticket day.
Had a bunch of tickets for like 2 cents, 3 cents.
All right, so now we're competing with Nickel Day. Now we have 2-cent and 3-cent tickets and everything. There was a prior question asked, and I guess I should have repeated the question. And again, what is the land like down there and everything? And I was just saying the land continues just to stay the way it is, and the lake and the land still looks beautiful down there. But again, it is private property. Yes?
Did the nature of the park change when the number of passengers, say, going by way of the Laurel line changed to people driving there? Did they have to reduce the park to make more parking lots, or how did that affect the operation of the park?
I think the question being asked again is how did, I guess, the end of the Laurel line, if you want to put it that, and more people coming to the park by via cars, how did that change the layout of the park or something? Basically, if you look at Rocky Glen, it's unique in that it had 3 parking lots. So I don't know the time frames of the parking lots, but I'm assuming that they may have been added to accommodate more cars over time. And of course, it was reconfigured down where the Laurel line area was. That actually became the back of the park where maintenance and things were, equipment and everything was held back there. And of course, with the $1 Million Coaster no longer being there, they built the coaster, the newer coasters, more closer by the highway, so that obviously people driving would now be able to see a coaster operating via car and may say, hey, let's go check that out, or whatever the case may be. So I believe it was reconfigured to accommodate more so now for your commuter-type traffic. Yes?
Where was the Pepin located?
The Pippin was located near the dam. Again, it was the idea of getting off the Laurel line and then getting onto a roller coaster.
The $1 million one was in the future?
The $1 Million Coaster was closer to the lake, while the Pippin was closer to the dam area. And this coaster would be the one that I was just describing that was close up by.
Yeah, that's later.
That was the last coaster. That again would be the $1 Million Coaster, which is closest to the lake area here. And the Pippin would be up in this area where the dam was. So this section up here would be more where the Pippin was located. This being a parking lot, that also being a parking lot at the very top and further off of the image, all the way over to the right would have been another parking lot.
The Pippin Coaster was next to the funhouse.
Next to the fun house?
And there was the Glen Canal. Glen Canal was there, then there was the Pippin Coaster, and then it was the walkway out to the Loreline. And when the Pippin Coaster burned, that was sort of the downfall of Jennings, because he lost 3 of his major attractions. Because the part of the funhouse went down with it too. And if you want to know what the parking lot, the Sterling's parking lot was free down there. That came up. You walked up the steps from the coaster over. And the other parking lot was Jennings. He charged, I don't know, 15 cents or
It was a quarter. In my research, I found it was a quarter.
And the other parking lot is up where there was what they call the baseball field, where the first drive-in theater was, with 2 speakers out, and you rolled your windows down to hear the sound.
Well, perhaps I need to also speak with you about this documentary and provide us some more information, because the information just continues to keep coming forward.
I lived in the parks. My mother and father was in business up there, and I was in that park since I was 2 until 17. Every summer, we rode all the rides free.
Yes?
What you said about the Pippa being near the dam, that's not true then. It's over on the right-hand side of that picture. It would be on the right-hand side of that picture someplace.
Yeah, it was. It was on
Okay,
the
well,
right-hand side.
that's a different location. It was by the funhouse, where the funhouse would be in the right-hand corner there, that picture, right?
And that was the one that they made into that was supposed to be a dance hall, and they made that into a fun house. For some reason, I don't know.
Oh, wow. Yeah, but that was, it would be
It
in
was
the
the
right-hand
Crystal
corner.
Palace. That was what the Crystal Palace was.
Again, more information continues to come forward on this documentary, which at this point is going to be a...
Canal was there.
Right.
Okay, we're getting out of control here, everybody. Everybody's got so many stories, I don't know where we're going here. All right, let me just...
They changed the name to the Glen Canal after.
When the war started, they changed the Glen Canal.
We have a question in the back, sir.
Pippin, I believe, went out to 502. It left the park. And when you went by
No.
Sterling's house, it went over the road there. That's right, that's right.
Okay, we're going to give everybody a sheet of paper and some pens, and they're going to draw the maps of what everybody has a version of the park. We'll combine it together, and we'll get one consensus. Okay. I understand one of our people in the audience has a picture, so we're going to try and get that then and be able to figure out all the details on it then. If I could move on then just a little bit more and do a couple other pieces of information or business. Here at the Historical Society, again, I mentioned the idea of, please, if you're not a member, please consider becoming a member of the Historical Society. Over to the left in the room, we have an exhibit by Dennis and Char Martin, who are very active here in the Historical Society. It's on the International Correspondence School exhibit, so if you have a chance, you want to take a look at that. We also have a whole bunch of Rocky Glen photos, memorabilia throughout the park, or throughout the, well, I guess it is a park. I did say it's going to be a park for a while today. Anyway, we do have that also here, so spend some time looking at that. But as I said, I want to have a little bit more fun with this idea of a lecture, and I got a couple trivia questions. They're going to be maybe easy, and we might have a couple prizes for the people who know the answers. All right, our first question. It's a two-parter. Now remember, I'm an educator, so because I'm an educator, now I got to ask questions like I'm a teacher here. What year was Rocky Glen founded, and what year did it close? If you can answer that question, we have a token for you, an original Rocky Glen token. And we also have an admission ticket from our marker dedication last year, which we had printed up, and it was given out to all the people who attended the marker dedication. So, what year was Rocky Glen founded? No. We're only doing one at a time. One hand up at a time. 1915, no.
1947.
Rocky Glen Park itself. Rocky Glen Park, when the actual park was founded.
1886.
1886. Now, do you know what the answer is when it closed? 1986. No. Wait a minute. This side over here gave me an answer. Who? What year did it close? Who's saying 87? Ah, now we got 3 people competing for 1 prize. Now I got to turn it into a sub prize or something. All right. The person who answered the question correctly first of 1886. You have the ticket or the token. What would you like? The token. Now, whoever answered it on this side